Barton County, Kansas, August 1896. The sun beat down on the vast, shimmering prairie, baking the buffalo grass to the color of old straw. Dust devils danced on the horizon, miniature cyclones of earth and heat. On the high plains, sanity was measured in shade and water, and the ruin of old Fort Zarah offered precious little of either. Its 4 limestone walls, 2 feet thick and 12 feet high, stood roofless and defiant, a soldier's abandoned rectangle baking under the relentless sky. It was a monument to a forgotten conflict, a landmark for cattle drives, and, to the settlers of Barton County, a pile of useless government stone. Which was why the sight of Trevithick Pengelly working there day after day was a source of endless, head-shaking amusement. He wasn't quarrying the stone for a foundation. He wasn't scavenging it for a well lining. He was, with the help of 2 hired farm hands, wrestling enormous cedar timbers into place atop the massive walls. He moved with a miner's deliberate economy, his every motion measured and sure, seemingly oblivious to the heat that sent sane men indoors. Beauregard Lofton, the county land assessor, reined in his horse, his starched collar already wilting. He watched for a long moment as Pengelly and his crew maneuvered a massive ridge beam. "It's a fool's errand, Pengelly," Lofton called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who understood land, laws, and the limits of common sense. "You're building a cook stove with no lid. You'll roast alive in this heat and you'll freeze solid come January." A farmer named Jebediah Cole, his wagon stopped on the track nearby, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "It's downright foolish," he agreed, nodding at Lofton. "That much stone will pull the cold in and hold it like a crypt. He's building his family a tomb." Pengelly paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the half-finished roof structure, then at the 2 men, his gaze calm and unreadable. He said nothing, simply picked up his adze and returned to shaping a joint. The sound of steel on wood was his only reply. The men exchanged a look that said it all. The Cornishman wasn't just quiet, he was mad. He was building a roof on a ruin, a hat on a skeleton, and expecting it to be a home. What did this Cornish tin miner, this outsider from the stone-ribbed coast of Redruth, understand about thermal mass and solar gain that the experienced, practical men of the Kansas prairie had so completely missed? What secret was locked in those 2-foot-thick limestone walls that only a man who'd spent his life underground could possibly comprehend? I promise you, the answer to that question is not just a lesson in history, but a profound lesson in physics, ingenuity, and the quiet triumph of observation over assumption. It's a story that proves the most powerful innovations often come not from creating something new, but from seeing what's already there with new eyes. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories of frontier resilience and forgotten genius, consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video. It helps us bring more of these incredible histories to light. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Trevithick Pengelly was not a farmer. He knew nothing of crop rotation or reading the signs of a coming hailstorm in the bellies of the clouds. He was not a carpenter by trade, though his hands were skilled with an axe and saw. He was a man of the deep earth. He was a product of the granite stopes and tin lodes of Cornwall, a world of hoisting engines, pump rods, and the constant percussive song of the double-jack hammer. His father and his father's father had been miners, men who understood the immense patient power of rock. They knew its weight, its dangers, and its secrets. They knew how stone behaved under pressure, how it held the chill of the deep earth, and how, in the engine houses, the massive granite walls surrounding the boilers would soak up the heat and radiate it for hours after the fires were banked. His hands knew the gritty residue of blasting powder, the heft of a drill steel, and the subtle language of stone speaking under a hammer's blow. He had brought his wife, Ilara, and their 2 young children, Morwenna and Jago, to America, not for gold, but for air. The miner's cough was a constant presence in the narrow, damp valleys of Cornwall, and he wanted his children to grow up under a wide, dry sky. Kansas offered that, but it also offered a winter of a ferocity he had never imagined. Their first winter, in a hastily constructed cottonwood cabin, had been a lesson in absolute misery. That winter of 1895 was a brutal teacher. The cold arrived not as a guest, but as an occupying army. A neighbor's new windmill pump rod, a marvel of modern steel, snapped with a sound like a rifle shot on its very first turn in the November frost. The county clerk, attempting to record a deed, found his ink had frozen solid in its well on the courthouse desk, the first bell of the morning still echoing. In their own cabin, Ilara's good wool coat, a treasured item from the old country, hung on a peg in the unheated parlor. One morning, Trevithick went to fetch it for her, and the collar, stiff with frost, cracked in his hands like a dry twig. They burned wood constantly, a whole precious cord in a week, yet the cold was relentless. It seeped through the chinking, poured down from the loft, and radiated from the very ground. They lived in a small circle of warmth around the stove, wearing their coats indoors, their breath pluming in the air just a few feet away. The children were always coughing. The winter was a siege, and they were losing. Trevithick knew he could not face another winter like that. He would not. The problem, as Pengelly came to understand it, was not simply the cold. The cold was a constant of the plains. The problem was the houses. The standard frontier cabin, whether of log or sod, was a thermal catastrophe. It was designed to keep out the wind and rain, not the physics of a polar vortex. A log cabin, even one chinked with the utmost care, was a study in failure. The logs themselves, typically 12 inches of cottonwood or pine, had minimal insulating value. Heat poured through them via conduction. Every seam, every joint, every knot was a potential pathway for air infiltration, for the frigid outside air to be sucked in by the draft of the hungry fireplace. A fire roared, consuming a fortune in firewood, but its radiant heat warmed only the objects in its direct line of sight. The far walls of the room remained freezing, their surfaces often coated in a thick layer of interior frost. You were roasting on one side and freezing on the other. The sod house, or soddy, was a marginal improvement in some ways, but it came with its own litany of woes. The thick earth walls offered better insulation, but they were a haven for insects, snakes, and vermin. In wet weather, they could become damp, muddy, and prone to mildew, filling the air with a musty, unhealthy chill. Worse, in the dry, driving cold of a Kansas blizzard, they offered little defense against the relentless wind that found every tiny crack. For the families inside, like that of Jebediah Cole, winter was a constant battle. Cole and his family spent the winter of '95 huddled in one room, the others closed off to conserve heat. They stuffed rags into the window frames, but the wind still whistled through, making the candle flames dance and flicker. His wife spent her days feeding the stove, a task that was both exhausting and terrifying, as their woodpile dwindled with alarming speed. They burned over 7 cords of wood that winter, an amount that represented a significant portion of a family's annual income, and still, they were never truly warm. The problem wasn't their diligence. The problem was their container. They were trying to heat a sieve. By the spring of 1896, Trevithick Pengelly had spent months observing. He wasn't looking at houses. He was looking at the land. He saw how the south-facing slopes of hills were the first to lose their snow. He saw how a granite boulder, exposed to the afternoon sun, would still be shedding a gentle warmth long after sunset. He saw the ruins of Fort Zarah, not as a pile of useless rock, but as an opportunity, a gift. It was an engine house without an engine, a massive, perfectly oriented stone box waiting for a lid. The construction began in the oppressive heat of late July. The first task was clearing the interior of the 24 by 36-foot rectangle. Decades of debris, wind-blown soil, and opportunistic cottonwood saplings had to be removed. Pengelly worked with a quiet intensity that baffled the men he hired. He didn't curse the heat or the labor. He simply worked. His movements economical, his focus absolute. Once the interior was cleared to its original stone floor, the real work began, building the roof. This was where his Cornish heritage asserted itself. He designed a hipped roof, a sturdy, four-sided structure that was inherently more stable in the high winds of the prairie than a simple gable. For the timber, he traveled 60 miles to a cedar break, selecting and paying for the trees himself, choosing them with a miner's eye for straightness and integrity. The main beams and rafters were massive, some measuring a full 12 inches square. He would accept nothing less. "That's enough wood to build 2 whole roofs, Pengelly," commented Silas Blackwood, the man who ran the local sawmill, as he delivered a load of planking. "You're wasting your money on all that heavy timber." Pengelly ran a hand over a cedar beam, its surface smelling of resin and earth. "Weight is stability, Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "and I'm not building for one winter, I'm building for all of them." The most pointed criticism came from Beauregard Lofton, who made it a point to ride by every week on his assessment rounds. Lofton was a man of ledgers and laws, and Pengelly's project offended his sense of order on multiple fronts. "You realize this structure is on unpatented federal land, don't you?" Lofton stated one afternoon, not as a question, but as a declaration. "It's a former military post. The Kansas Abandoned Post Statute of 1887 is quite clear. Squatting is illegal, and this is the most flagrant case of it I've ever seen. I am citing you, sir. You will receive a notice to vacate by April." Trevithick paused from fitting a king post, his face beaded with sweat. He looked at Lofton, then at the massive stone walls around him. "By April," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "A lot can happen by April, Mr. Lofton." He turned and went back to his work, leaving the assessor fuming in his saddle. Ilara, his wife, was more practical in her concerns. One evening, as the massive roof structure was finally taking shape, she stood with him inside the stone walls as the sun set, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet. "It feels like living in a castle keep, Trevithick," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the enormous space. "But will it be a home? It's so big, so stony." He placed a hand on the south wall. The limestone, having soaked in the afternoon sun for hours, was radiating a gentle, persistent warmth. "Feel that, my love," he said. "That is the secret. The sun is our furnace. This stone is our fuel. We just need to give it a good hat to keep the warmth in." The science behind Trevithick Pengelly's madness was a simple, elegant principle of physics: thermal mass. The conventional frontier cabin was built on the principle of insulation, a thin barrier to slow the transfer of heat. But insulation alone is a losing battle against a constant, overwhelming cold. Pengelly's fort house was built on a different principle entirely. It was a thermal battery. Let's break down the numbers. The walls of Fort Zarah were 2 feet thick, constructed of dense Kansas limestone. Limestone has a density of approximately 150 pounds per cubic foot. A single 1-foot-long section of the 12-foot-high wall contained 24 cubic feet of stone, 2 at 2ft thick x 12 alfwalry high x 1ft long, weighing a staggering 3,600 pounds. The entire perimeter of the structure was 120 feet. That meant Pengelly had surrounded his family with over 432,000 pounds of stone, nearly 220 tons of limestone. This enormous mass acted as a heat sink. The key was the low angle of the winter sun. From about 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., even on the coldest days, the sun's rays would strike the south-facing wall directly. The dark, weathered limestone was an excellent absorber of this solar radiation. Hour after hour, it would drink in the sun's energy, converting light into heat. A single linear foot of that south wall could store an estimated 24,000 BTUs, British thermal units, of heat energy. A BTU is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. To put it in perspective, burning a standard kitchen match releases about 1 BTU. Pengelly's south wall was storing the energy equivalent of tens of thousands of matches, but storage is only half the equation. The other half is release. As the sun set and the outside temperature plummeted, the process would reverse. The heat stored deep within the stone would begin to slowly, steadily radiate back into the living space. This is the magic of high thermal mass. It creates a time lag, a thermal flywheel effect. The walls that absorbed the afternoon's heat were now releasing it through the night and into the next day, long after the sun was gone. The calculations were astonishing. Even in the most extreme conditions with an outside temperature of 22 degrees, the heat loss through that massive stone envelope was projected to be around 6,000 BTUs per hour. A small, efficient potbelly stove, the kind that barely made a dent in a drafty log cabin, could easily produce 20,000 or 30,000 BTUs per hour. In Pengelly's stone fortress, it meant that a tiny fire, consuming maybe a seventh of the firewood of his neighbors, would be more than enough to keep the interior at a comfortable 68 degrees. The stone wasn't just a wall. It was a silent, massive, and incredibly efficient partner in the business of staying warm. It was a system that worked with the cycles of nature, not against them. The winter of 1896 arrived with a quiet, menacing beauty. The first snows fell in late November, a gentle blanket that softened the hard edges of the prairie. But by mid-January, the true enemy revealed itself. A high-pressure system, a vast dome of Arctic air, slid down from Canada and settled over the Great Plains. The newspapers called it a polar outbreak. The old-timers called it a killer. For 12 consecutive days, the temperature did not rise above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plunged to a soul-crushing minus 30, and with it came the wind. A relentless 30-mile-per-hour gale from the north that scoured the landscape. It stripped the insulating blanket of snow from the open fields, leaving the frozen earth bare. It made the air so cold it felt like a physical blow to the face. Kerosene in lamps burned with a strange, pale blue flame, its energy consumed by the sheer cold of the surrounding air. At Jebediah Cole's farm, the misery of the previous winter returned, magnified. The wind drove the cold through his cabin walls, as if they were made of cheesecloth. They burned wood at a frantic pace, but the house never felt warm. The frost on the interior walls grew thick as a man's thumb. His children huddled under a mountain of quilts, their faces pinched and pale. The sound of the wind was a constant, shrieking torment, but inside the stone walls of old Fort Zarah, a different reality was unfolding. The north wind hammered against the 2-foot-thick limestone wall and fell away defeated. It found no cracks, no chinks, no purchase. Inside, the air was still. The only sound was the gentle crackle of the small pot-belly stove and the quiet hum of family life. Trevithick fed the stove a few small logs in the morning and a few more in the evening. That was all. The massive stone walls, having absorbed the pale, emasculated, low-angled sun on the southern face the day before, were now breathing that warmth back into the room. The air temperature held at a steady, almost unbelievable 68 degrees. Morwenna and Jago played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, their laughter echoing softly in the huge, warm space. Ilara went about her work not in a desperate struggle for survival, but in the calm rhythm of a normal day. The great proof sat on a simple wooden shelf mounted on the south wall. It was a large earthenware crock containing the dough for Cornish saffron buns, a Shrove Tuesday tradition. In any other house in Barton County, that crock would have been a frozen, solid mass. The yeast would have been killed instantly by the encroaching cold. But here, on its shelf against the warm stone, the dough was alive. Protected by the 220 tons of sun-warmed limestone, it continued its slow, sweet-smelling rise, a golden promise of the festival to come. The contrast was absolute. While the rest of the prairie was locked in a desperate, shivering battle against the cold, the Pengelly family was living in a bubble of perpetual, gentle autumn. On the 10th day of the Polar Outbreak, Beauregard Lofton was making his miserable rounds. The tack circuit waited for no man, and certainly not for the weather. His horse was tired, his sled was heavy, and the cold was a physical pain that gnawed at his bones. He was bundled in every layer he owned, but the 30-degree air, driven by the 30-mile-an-hour wind, found its way through. As he approached the stark outline of Fort Zarah, a sharp crack echoed in the frigid air. The sled lurched violently to one side. Cursing, Lofton pulled the horse to a halt and climbed down. A runner, made of good, solid oak, had cracked clean through, the extreme cold having made it as brittle as glass. He was stranded, miles from the nearest town, with the sun already low in the sky. His first instinct was panic. His second, survival. The only shelter in this desolate landscape was the very structure he held in such professional contempt. He unhitched the horse and led it to the relative calm of the leeward eastern wall. His plan was to whittle a temporary splint for the runner, a desperate, freezing task. He sought the least windy spot he could find, which happened to be against the massive south wall, the face that had been in the sun. He leaned back against the stone, bracing himself for the biting cold he knew it must hold. In his experience, a stone wall in this weather was like leaning against a block of pure ice. It would suck the life heat right out of you. He pressed his back against the limestone, and then he froze. Not from the cold, but from sheer, dumbfounding shock. There was no cold. Instead, a slow, deep, impossible warmth soaked through the thick layers of his wool coat. It wasn't a hot, surface warmth. It was a profound, radiant energy, the feeling of a hearth brick taken from a gentle fire. He pushed himself away, staring at the wall as if it were an apparition. He reached out a gloved hand, then, thinking he was imagining things, pulled the glove off with his teeth. He pressed his bare palm flat against the weathered limestone. It was warm, unmistakably, undeniably warm as a living thing. The air around him was a torment of wind and ice, yet the wall itself was a source of gentle, life-giving heat. For a long minute, Beauregard Lofton, a man of rules and reason, simply stood there, his bare hand pressed against the impossible stone. The entire world he understood, the rules of heat and cold, of building and survival, had just been turned completely upside down. He finally understood. Pengelly hadn't built a foolish cook stove. He had built a fortress of warmth, powered by the sun itself. Shaking his head in disbelief, he walked around to the heavy wooden door Pengelly had built and knocked. The door swung open and a wave of warm, still air washed over him, carrying the scent of baking bread and cedar. Trevithick Pengelly stood there, holding a lamp. He wasn't wearing a coat. Behind him, Lofton could see a child, a little girl sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden doll. She was in her shirt sleeves. "Lofton," Pengelly said, his voice calm, without a hint of triumph, "you look cold. Come in." Lofton stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the shrieking wind. The sudden peace and warmth were disorienting, like stepping into another world. He looked around the vast, lamp-lit room. He saw the small stove, barely glowing. He saw the children, healthy and comfortable. And he saw, on the shelf against the south wall, the crock of gently risen dough. He pointed a trembling finger at it. "In this cold, your dough is rising?" Ilara smiled from across the room. "It's for the saffron buns," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Lofton looked from the dough to the wall, then to Pengelly. He was a man who had been proven profoundly wrong, and he knew it. All the statutes, all the regulations, all his confident mockery, it all melted away in the face of this simple, undeniable proof. He finally looked at Pengelly, not as a squatter or a fool, but as a genius. "You didn't build a house, Pengelly," Lofton said, his voice full of a new and unfamiliar awe. He searched for the words. "You didn't build a fortress, you built a season. You've captured August, and you're keeping it here for January." The story of Lofton's conversion, of the land assessor spending the night in the warmth of the ruin while a blizzard raged, became a local legend. When the legal notice to vacate arrived in February, Lofton himself rode out to deliver it. He handed the paper to Pengelly, then promptly tore it into small pieces. "I'll file it as unservable due to weather," he said with a wry smile. "We'll see where we are in April." By April, Lofton had personally drafted a petition to the state land office, co-signed by a dozen of the county's most prominent citizens, arguing for a special dispensation. But the true spread of Pengelly's idea came through a different channel. A cousin of Ilara's, visiting from the Cornish mining communities in Grass Valley, California, wrote a detailed letter home about the incredible stone house. The letter was so compelling, it was published in the Cornish American, a newspaper that connected the diaspora of miners across the country. The March 1897 edition ran a piece titled "A Cornishman's Castle on the Kansas Plains," detailing Pengelly's method, the use of an abandoned stone envelope, and the addition of a heavy, well-built roof. The article struck a chord. Cornish immigrants, men who understood stone and hardship, were scattered all across the West. They recognized the deep logic in what Pengelly had done. They knew of similar ruins, abandoned forts, old mills, failed mining structures dotting the landscape. The idea was simple, radical, and perfectly suited to their skills and their needs. By the following autumn, the idea had taken root. 5 other Cornish families in Barton and neighboring Rice counties had identified and occupied similar ruins, turning forgotten stone shells into warm, secure homes. Pengelly's quiet innovation had become a movement. Today, we have a name for what Trevithick Pengelly did. We call it passive solar design. We talk about trombe walls, thermal mass, and building envelopes. We use complex software to model heat gain and loss. We have entire industries dedicated to creating sustainable, energy-efficient homes. But in 1896, a Cornish miner with no formal education, armed only with the ancestral knowledge of stone and a desperate need to keep his family safe, figured it all out with his own 2 hands. He saw a ruin, not as a relic of the past, but as a key to the future. His fort house was a century ahead of its time, a working model of a principle that modern architecture is only now rediscovering. It stands as a testament to the fact that the most advanced solutions are often the simplest, hidden in plain sight. In the end, the story of Trevithick Pengelly is more than just a tale of a clever house. It's a story about a different way of seeing the world. The other settlers saw winter as an enemy to be fought, a force to be battled with bigger fires and thicker walls. They were locked in a war of attrition with nature, and it was a war they were losing. Pengelly saw it differently. He didn't try to fight the winter. He didn't try to conquer the cold. He simply stepped aside. He saw the immense power of the sun and the patient strength of the stone, and he found a way to join them together. He understood that the solution wasn't to build a better shield against the world, but to build a better relationship with it. He didn't build a house against winter. He asked a soldier's abandoned wall to hold the sun and gave it a roof. It's a profound shift in thinking, from confrontation to cooperation. It's a lesson that was learned in the heart of a Kansas blizzard, one that echoes down to us today, reminding us that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in resistance, but in intelligent, humble partnership with the powerful forces of the natural world. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story. If you found Trevithick Pengelly's ingenuity as inspiring as I do, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does this story make you think about our modern relationship with housing and energy? We'll see you next time. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The underlying techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and engineering concepts. Any application of these or similar building techniques today should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.